Good evening, dear friends. Before we begin, let me thank you for spending your time here with me. If stories of family of sacrifice and of truth hidden in the quiet corners of our lives speak to you, I invite you to subscribe. Stay with us and you'll find many stories that remind us of what really matters. Tonight's story is titled The Microphone in the Hall. A father's sweat cannot be claimed by another. The hall was filled with light that afternoon, chandeliers glittering over rows of chairs draped in white. Proud families sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in excitement, their hands clutching flowers and cameras. It was a graduation ceremony, the kind of day meant to honor effort, not pride. Max, silver-haired and steady despite the years, sat quietly near the front. His suit was a little worn at the edges, but his eyes shone with a rare mixture of weariness and hope. He had waited 3 decades for this 30 years of labor of nickels and dimes, saved of calloused hands, shaping a future for his grandson. Today, that future would be crowned with a diploma. Then, without warning, the air shifted. From the side aisle, his eldest son stepped forward. His voice was louder than it needed to be, carrying not pride but bitterness. He shoved past the usher, grabbed the microphone from its stand, and barked into it, "None of this would have happened without me. I paid the tuition. This is my doing." The words cracked through the hall like lightning across a clear sky. Conversations died. Laughter halted mid-breath. 1,000 faces turned their gazes, snapping toward the stage. And in that single frozen instant, all eyes slid toward Max. The shock line had landed. The chandeliers seemed to dim the bright banners above the graduates, trembled in the air conditioning, and the silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Max's hands resting on his lap clenched ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, but his eyes did not move from the stage. The moment stretched unbearable, as if the whole hall had forgotten how to breathe. It was not just the words that wounded. It was the theft and attempt to take 30 years of sweat and quiet sacrifice and rebrand it under someone else's name. And in that suffocating silence, the story truly began. The silence of the hall clung to Max like a second skin, but inside his mind the noise was deafening. He was no longer sitting beneath chandeliers and banners. He was back in the dust of a half-built house, 40 pounds younger, 30 years poorer, and infinitely more determined. He remembered the mornings before dawn when the world was still wrapped in darkness. His alarm would buzz sharp and merciless, and he would drag himself out of bed. The air smelled of cement and sawdust, the kind that never leaves your clothes. His boots, worn at the soles, carried him to construction sites where the pay was meager but steady enough to tuck away a few dollars. Each envelope he sealed, each bill he slipped into the bank was marked in his memory not by the number but by what it meant. One more step toward keeping his promise. His grandson would have more. His grandson would never feel the sting of doors slammed in his face because tuition was unpaid. On Sundays, when others rested, Max worked double shifts. He still recalled the echo of hammer against wood, the metallic sting of nails driven deep, the ache in his shoulders that no aspirant could touch. And at night, when he finally sat down to eat his plate, was plain bread, beans, and sometimes nothing more than tea. He didn't mind. He told himself over and over, it's not hunger. It's investment. The sacrifices piled up quietly like layers of brick in a wall. Only he knew he was building. His son never saw it. Or perhaps he refused to. There had been times when Max slipped him money for emergencies, only to hear later it had gone to bar tabs and poker games. Betrayal in small doses, so small that Max swallowed them without complaint. Now in the glittering hall, with his son's voice still ringing in the air, those memories resurfaced not as nostalgia, but as accusation. He had borne the weight, carried it alone, while another now tried to seize the credit. His knuckles tightened around the program booklet in his hands. The paper crumpled slightly, though he didn't notice. He only saw the faces of men at the work site, grinning through cracked teeth, patting his back after a long shift. He only smelled the sweat that had soaked through his shirts on those blistering summer days. He only heard his own voice whispering to himself as he walked to the bank, "This is for him. Always for him." And for the first time that day, a thought formed, not bitter but clear, they will know. Someday they will know. The smell of cement and rain still clung to Max's memory, when another sound intruded, the echo of his son's voice, carrying over the laughter of neighbors one summer evening years ago. The two worlds overlapped, the sweat-soaked man counting crumpled bills in private, and the same man standing just behind a hedge, overhearing words not meant for his ears. "I pay for everything," his son bragged, a beer can snapping open in his hand. "School tuition, my money. My kid's future, my effort. The old man doesn't have a dime to his name. Without me, we'd be nothing." The men around him chuckled, raising their bottles. The sound was sharp, mocking, bouncing off the walls of Max's chest like stones. Max had been carrying a small envelope that night, the kind he took to the bank every week. Inside were a few folded bills, his overtime wages from laying bricks under a punishing sun. He could still feel the weight of it in his pocket, warm against his leg as if it carried every hour he had given up. He didn't step forward. He didn't argue. He simply walked back into the house, each step quieter than the last. The envelope remained in his pocket until morning, when he deposited it, his signature shaky but firm. Sacrifice carried out in silence, betrayal swallowed whole. But even silence has an aftertaste. In the dim light of his kitchen, the bulb buzzing above, Max sat with a cup of coffee gone cold. His son's words replayed, each repetition sharper than the last. The pride that should have belonged to him was stolen, repainted as someone else's charity. That night, as the crickets sang outside and the floor creaked under his tired feet, he pressed his palm against the worn wood of the kitchen table. One day, he whispered, to no one, truth will stand on its own legs, and when it does, lies will have nowhere to sit. The words barely left his lips, but they lingered like smoke in the air. Back in the present, in the bright hall of the graduation, Max's ears still burned with the old echo. His son's voice from years ago, and his son's voice now boasting, stealing, claiming. The same script repeated. Only this time, Max felt something stir in his chest. The break in the echo. The rhythm would not remain unchallenged forever. The kitchen had always been Max's quiet battleground. The clink of utensils, the faint hiss of the stove, the smell of rice steaming, these were the sounds and scents of routine sacrifice. On one particular evening, the house was filled with voices from the dining room, his son laughing louder than the rest, fork scraping against his plate with impatience. Max lingered by the sink, his own plate still empty, washed clean before it could ever be used. He had set aside the last portion of meat for his grandson, pretending he wasn't hungry. The boy needed strength. Max convinced himself that his stomach could manage without. The sound of chewing reached him from the next room. The boy's laughter, mixed with his son's careless banter, traveled back like a cruel refrain. Max leaned against the counter, palm pressing hard against the cool tile, listening. Then came the sting. Through the thin walls, his son's voice again, sharp, careless, as if truth were clay to be molded. "You see, this roof, this meal, all me. Without me, this family wouldn't last a day. The old man's just waiting to fade." The words cracked something inside Max. His breath caught, and his fingers trembled against the sink. The water dripped from the faucet, slow, steady drops like a ticking clock. He stared at his empty plate. For years he had traded fullness for silence, hunger for dignity. And still the story was rewritten in someone else's name. For a moment the room tilted. I remember gripping the counter edge, my reflection staring back from the faint shine of the steel faucet. Hollow eyes, a jaw set tight. Was this the cost of love, to vanish? Even while alive, I carried the plate back to the cupboard, sliding it into its place with a dull clatter. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. But the sound stayed with me, the echo of porcelain meeting wood. It was small, almost fragile, but it broke the rhythm of lies. Back in the present, under the blazing lights of the graduation hall, the memory folded into the moment like a blade hidden in cloth. The same son who once rewrote every meal, every roof, every sacrifice, now shouting into a microphone, claiming an entire future. My hands curled at my sides. I felt the weight of every empty plate I had ever put away. And for the first time, I knew they would not remain silent forever. The night after the empty plate still lived in my chest like an unanswered question. I could not sleep. The house was quiet, except for the clock ticking in the hallway, steady, merciless, like it had been all my life. On the dresser in my bedroom lay the old pocket watch. It was the one thing I had carried through youth, through factory shifts, through the war of bills and winters. Its chain was frayed, its face scratched, but inside it still ticked with stubborn precision. My wife once called it my second heartbeat. That morning I wrapped it in a cloth and walked downtown. The air carried the smell of rain on pavement mingled with exhaust. I stepped into a pawn shop where the bell above the door gave a tired chime. The glass counters gleamed under fluorescent light filled with cameras, rings, guitars, things traded for survival, not luxury. I placed the watch on the counter. My hand hesitated before letting go. The pawnbroker lifted it, turning it over, unimpressed. Old, he muttered, but still working. 50. I swallowed. 50. The number barely covered a week's worth of my grandson's textbooks. But I nodded. My hand reached for the bills, crisp and indifferent, while the watch disappeared into a drawer. Walking home, the money burned in my pocket, not from pride, but from loss. That watch had marked every late shift, every Christmas morning when I came home smelling of iron and oil. Now it belonged to no one. I handed the money to my son without a word. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't even look me in the eye. About time, he muttered, sliding it into his wallet, already planning how to spend it. The silence after his words stretched long. I saw my grandson in the corner, his head bent over homework pencil, tapping nervously. I forced a smile and patted his shoulder, telling him to study hard. But inside, something cracked further. Back in the graduation hall, that memory rushed through me like a cold draft. The son who once took the watch without a glance now stood before hundreds trying to steal, not just money, but legacy itself. My jaw tightened. The echo of the pawnshop bell mixed with the electric hum of the microphone in his hand. A watch for $50. A life for 30 years. And still, he shouted as if he alone had built everything. My hand brushed the pocket of my coat where another object now rested, something heavier than money, something unstealable. The hall held its breath, and I knew my voice would soon break the silence. The hall still throbbed with silence, as if the walls themselves had frozen at my son's outburst. I felt every eye upon us. My breath trembled, but before I could step forward, a chair creaked from the back row. A man rose, slowly, gray hair combed back, shoulders bent yet steady. It was Harris, my old foreman from the steel mill. He had walked with a limp since the accident on the line, but his voice, when it cut across the room, carried the sharp ring of molten iron. I was there, he said, pointing with a trembling hand. I saw him come in before dawn, leave after dark. 30 years, no complaint, no break. If any boy here thinks tuition fell from the sky, he should walk a mile in steel boots. The room shifted. Some gasped, others nodded. My son stiffened, but I saw his face pale under the spotlight. He gripped the microphone tighter, as if Harris's words had pried open a truth he could not contain. I closed my eyes. For a second I was back in that furnace-lit room, sparks spraying like fireflies, the roar of machines drowning out every thought, sweat stinging my eyes, shirt clinging to my back. Harris's shout back then, "Max, hold steady, this line feeds families." I'd held steady, always. When I opened my eyes, Harris was still standing, his voice cracking yet unyielding. You think money raised itself? No. It was bone, blood, and nights no man should carry alone. And he carried them. The hall broke into whispers. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their gowns. Some parents leaned forward, eyes narrowing on my son. The echo of Harris's words was an iron weight no one could ignore. My son's jaw clenched. He tried to speak again, raising the microphone, but the feedback screeched a metallic protest. The sound jolted through me like the screech of steel tearing on the line. The break of silence. The break of lies. I took one step forward, my cane tapping against the polished floor. Harris's eyes met mine across the hall, and in that glance I felt the years of sacrifice coil into a single moment, ready to unravel. The rotation of angles shifted, no longer the accused. I was becoming the witness, and soon the voice. And when I opened my mouth, it would not be for myself alone, but for the truth Harris had lit like a forge in front of everyone. I felt the cane steady beneath my hand, though my knees quivered like old beams under too much load. The screech of the microphone still hung in the air, sharp as a blade before dissolving into a silence that pressed on every chest in the hall. I reached the stage slowly, each tap of my cane echoing like a hammer striking steel. My son stood there rigid, his hand gripping the microphone, his face defiant but shadowed by doubt. Harris's words had cracked his mask, but it was my turn now. I raised my hand, palm open. For a moment he resisted. Our eyes locked, father and son, not as equals, but as two histories colliding. Finally he let go. The microphone was warm, still trembling from his grip. My son said this education was bought with his money. My voice broke at first, the weight of decades tightening my throat. But I steadied it, let the silence hold me up. No, it was bought with 30 years of steel dust of nights. My wife stitched my shirts while I coughed black into my hands. It was bought with mornings I left before the sun and came home after it died. Gasps rippled. The words didn't need force. They carried their own gravity. I felt the shift, the hall tilting, students leaning forward, parents exchanging glances. My voice became the brake line, cutting the silence into fragments that fell heavy on the floor. I looked down at my hands, rough veins, raised, calloused from years of gripping tools. Then I raised them for all to see. These hands carried him. These hands carried this family. And not once did they ask for thanks. But today, I cannot let them be erased. The spotlight caught the shine of sweat on my forehead, the quiver of my lip. For a second, my eyes burned, not from shame, but from the raw heat of holding in too much truth for too long. The echo returned Harris's words in the back row, my own memories in the mill, my wife's whispers when I wanted to give up. They all rose together, crowding my chest until they broke loose through the microphone. I turned not just to my son, but to the hall. You see a diploma. You see a stage. But what I see, what I feel is every nail, every shift, every back bent to make this moment possible. And no man, not even my own blood, will rob that truth. A murmur swept the room. My son's face strained of color. His lips moved, but no sound came. The balance had shifted. The hall no longer saw me as the old man with a cane, but as the furnace that had never gone cold. I held the microphone closer, my breath catching in it, and whispered so it carried to the farthest rows. This moment does not belong to lies. It belongs to sacrifice. And in that breath the hall stilled again, only this time the silence was mine. The microphone in my hand still hummed with the weight of my words. I could feel the hall leaning like a ship, caught between waves, one side dragging toward shame, the other lifting toward truth. Then a soft sound broke the silence, a sob, delicate but sharp enough to slice through the tension. It was my granddaughter. She stood in her graduation robe, the cap slightly crooked from where her trembling hand had brushed it. Her eyes, bright wet, shimmering like glass under the lights, were fixed on me, not on her father. The diploma she had clutched so tightly now dangled by her side, forgotten. She whispered, though the hall was so still everyone heard, "Grandpa, I didn't know." Her words scattered across the hall like autumn leaves caught in a gust. 100 heads turned from her father to me, from arrogance to sacrifice. I turned the microphone, slowly lowering it, just enough so my voice reached her. Not the ceiling, you didn't have to know, child. That's what love does, it hides its scars, so you can walk free. She pressed both hands to her chest, and the sob grew louder. Her knees buckled slightly, and Harris, still in the front row, reached instinctively to steady her. For a moment I saw in that gesture the truth blood might falter, but innocence still clung to her. Then the angle shifted, my view gave way to theirs. I felt the audience's eyes tracing the path from my cane to my worn hands to the tears running down her face. Symbol against symbol, the cane that had carried weight. The diploma meant to honor work, the tears they could not be bought. Echo, and break my granddaughter's cry, echoed my 30 years of silence. But the break was here, truth finally spoken aloud. She lifted her head again, voice trembling, but sure this time. "Grandpa, this is your day as much as mine." A murmur swelled into applause, hesitant at first, then steady growing like rain filling a dry riverbed. My son shrank into his chair, his hand falling from his lap, as if it no longer had strength. And in that applause, I felt the first shift of victory, not the final one, not yet, but the bridge between generations. Her tears had turned the hall, her voice had anchored the truth. I pressed the microphone closer once more, chest heaving. Then let the world hear it not just today, but every day forward. A diploma stands taller when built on sacrifice, not stolen words. The hall erupted again, the sound rushing like a storm wind through the rafters. And in that storm I saw her tears glisten, not from sorrow, but from pride. The applause still pulsed like waves, but within it new voices began to rise. At first it was only murmurs scattered like sparks across dry wood. Then, as if carried by an unseen current, the murmurs turned into words. From the left aisle, a gray-haired man in a work jacket stood. His voice was rough but steady. I worked with him. 30 years in the factory. I saw him stay late when the rest of us went home. Don't let anyone say those bills paid themselves. The hall hushed, then stirred again. From the right, a woman in her nurse's scrubs, she must have rushed from a shift, lifted her hand. He came in for checkups after his shift's blood pressure through the roof hands swollen from lifting. And never once did he complain. He just asked if he'd live long enough to see his granddaughter graduate. This she pointed toward me, and then to the stage. This is that day. The room shifted again. I felt the air thicken, the weight of every story layering on top of mine. My son sat, rigid eyes darting, as if looking for an exit that no longer existed. A neighbor near the back stood next to his flannel shirt tucked unevenly, his cap pulled low. Every winter he cleared the sidewalks, not just for himself, but for the whole block. While some of us slept, he was out there with his shovel. If you think he couldn't pay tuition, look at his hands. They've already paid 1,000 times over. Their voices came like echoes of my own silence, each one breaking open what I had buried. I gripped the microphone tighter, chest trembling. For the first time I felt I wasn't carrying this burden alone. The hall itself had turned witness. I looked out across the rows at strangers and friends, co-workers and neighbors, their faces all lit by the same truth. And then I shifted my voice lower, speaking as if to each of them, yet knowing it was my son who needed to hear it most. You see, it wasn't just my fight. Every scar I carry, every drop of sweat was seen. You can lie to yourself, but you can't erase what a community remembers. The crowd roared again, louder, fuller voices overlapping like a choir without rehearsal. Hands clapped, feet stomped, chairs creaked beneath the weight of shared conviction. And there, at the center of it all, I stood not as a lone father against betrayal, but as the sum of every witness who had ever seen me give when there was nothing left to give. The hall had become my courtroom, and the verdict was echoing already. The noise of the hall still trembled in my bones, when my son lurched forward, his chair scraping the polished floor with a shriek that sliced through applause. His face burned red, jaw clenched, and in his eyes was not remorse but desperation. He reached out, grabbing the microphone from my hands with fingers that shook not from age but from fury. "This isn't true," he barked, his voice cracking yet defiant. "He's twisting it, making it look like he's the hero. I paid the fees. Without me, none of this would have happened." For a heartbeat silence threatened to crack the air again. But the silence this time wasn't like before. It was heavier, weighted by the echoes of witness voices still lingering in the room. I did not move to snatch the microphone back. Instead, I stood still, my cane planted firmly at my side, my other hand resting lightly against the edge of the lectern. My breath slowed. The hall seemed to tilt, angles, shifting light glared from the chandeliers above, casting sharp lines across his face, highlighting every flicker of panic. The echo and break played itself out. He echoed the same old claim, and in the very act of repeating it, the break became visible. The more he insisted, the more hollow it sounded. Someone in the audience muttered, "But we know what we saw." Another voice sharper, "The truth doesn't fear the light." I let him speak, his words tumbling like a rope, fraying in his own hands. Then when his breath finally caught, I raised my palm, not in anger but in finality. My voice came steady, measured, carrying the rhythm of years in which silence was my only language. "You can grab the microphone." You can raise your voice, but you cannot rewrite 30 years of sweat. The cane tapped once against the floor, a sound that cut through the charged stillness. I let it anchor me as I continued, my tone shifting lower like the rumble before thunder. This hall is not fooled by noise. They've seen. They've lived beside me. And you, my son, you mistake volume for truth. But truth needs no shouting. From the audience, a ripple of nods, murmurs the rotation of faces, all angles pointed now at him, cornering him in a cage of his own defiance. His shoulders slumped slightly, though his lips still parted as if searching for another line. Nothing came. I reached forward, then not to fight, but to reclaim. My hand covered the microphone gently, my grip steady, the hall watching the transfer. He hesitated, then released. For the first time that day, he looked small. I lifted the microphone, feeling its weight, not as metal, but as symbol, keys, papers, canes, all of it condensed into this single object. And when I spoke again, my voice did not tremble. Tonight, the truth has been witnessed. And no hand, not even blood, can take that away. The hall erupted, not just applause this time, but a standing wave, people rising row by row, the sound pressing against the ceiling like a tide that could not be turned back. And I stood there, center of the storm, knowing the climax had only just begun to crest. The applause had not yet faded when I felt the silence press in again, a silence that carried more weight than the noise before. My son sat 2 steps behind me, shoulders hunched, his chest rising and falling as if he were drowning in air. The microphone was in my hand now, but I knew words alone would not close this wound. Noise against noise leaves nothing but echoes. What breaks an echo is proof. I reached down to the worn leather satchel leaning against the lectern. Its strap had cut into my palm during the long walk here, though no one noticed. For years, it carried groceries, spare tools, scraps of receipts. Tonight, it carried something else. The hall held its breath as I unbuckled the clasp. Paper rustled brittle against my fingers. I pulled out a small blue ledger, corners, frayed pages thick with time. The overhead lights caught the shine of the ink rows of numbers marching like soldiers across yellowed lines. This, I said, my voice low, carrying more in its quiet than in all his shouting, is the truth you cannot tear apart. I opened it. The pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, a smell that took me back to late nights at the kitchen table, the lamp burning, low sweat dripping into my shirt collar as I wrote each entry. 30 years of deposits. 30 years of skipped meals, overtime shifts, calloused hands gripping pen instead of hammer. I turned the book outward, slow enough for the first row to see. Then I stepped forward, the cane echoing on the stage boards, rotating the angle so the audience could lean closer, faces sharpening in the glow. Every page told the same story, paychecks broken into smaller numbers, saved again and again until they became tuition books of future. Someone gasped. A woman in the front row whispered, every month he saved every month. My son's face flushed darker, his lips trembling not with fury now, but with the collapse of excuses. His own words, repeated so often, shattered against the numbers inked into those pages. Echo and break, full and final. I held the ledger high, the microphone trembling slightly in my other hand. My voice rose not from anger, but from a lifetime finally unsealed. You claimed it was your sacrifice. But this is 30 years of mine. 30 years I chose not to spend on myself, but to place in this book for him. The hall shifted, every angle converging on me. The chandelier light fell brighter, bouncing off the pale blue cover like a halo. My son shrank in his seat, and I felt perhaps for the first time that his noise had no ground left to stand on. I lowered the ledger onto the lectern with care, letting the microphone amplify the thud of its landing. Then I said the words that clinched the moment into permanence: money does not lie. Numbers do not bend, and a father's ledger cannot be stolen. The hall erupted again, but this time the applause was joined by a wave of voices, a collective murmur of awe, of respect, of judgment that no longer belonged to me alone. And there, with the ledger open for all to see, the night took its turn. The ledger lay open under the harsh light, its ink numbers speaking louder than any argument. Yet the silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting for others to fill it. And they did. From the second row, a man in a gray suit rose. His hair was thin, his voice steady, the kind that comes from years of practice in classrooms. He cleared his throat and spoke not to me, but to the crowd. I was his teacher in 10th grade. I remember seeing him come to school in worn shoes, never asking for more, never showing off. And I remember who paid for his new textbooks. Your father did. He came to me in person, handed me the envelope, said, "Make sure he has what he needs." The words struck like a bell. My son's shoulders jerked, his eyes darting toward the man, then down again. Before the echo faded, another voice rose. This time it was the retired foreman from the factory. His hands were rough, his back bent, but his eyes gleamed with memory. I worked alongside him. Nights, weekends, holidays. He never complained. When we cashed our paychecks, most of us went home. But he went straight to the credit union, line after line, always depositing. We teased him. "What's the use of saving when you could buy yourself a better coat?" He only smiled and said, "It's not for me." The hall shifted. Heads turned. Angles rotated, some toward me, some toward my son, many toward the ledger that now seemed heavier than stone. And then, softly but firmly, came the voice of our neighbor, a woman who had lived across the fence for decades. Her hands clutched her purse as if holding memory itself. I saw him on winter nights sitting at the kitchen table. The lamp burned late, and his head was bowed over papers. I thought he was writing letters, but now I know he was building this ledger. Her words broke against the silence like glass scattering fragments into every corner of the hall. I tightened my grip on the microphone, feeling its cold weight. For years I had carried this story alone. Tonight, others carried it with me. I looked at my son, his face pale, his jaw clenched as though silence could shield him. But silence now was no shield, it was exposure. I leaned closer to the microphone, voice steady, each word deliberate. You see, it is not only my proof, it is theirs. They watched. They remembered. And now they speak. The hall erupted, not in applause this time, but in murmurs, gasps, the rising tide of truth made public. My son's claim had not only broken it, had collapsed. The ledger remained open, but now it was more than ink. It was witness. It was memory. It was judgment. And it was only the beginning. The murmur in the hall swelled, then broke apart into fragments, questions, gasps, whispers that rippled like wind through tall grass. The ledger still lay open on the podium, its pages glowing under the spotlight, and I felt the weight of all those voices that had just spoken for me. But the silence that followed pressed me back into memory, pulling me into the shadows of my own past. I saw myself again, a factory at midnight, my palms raw, the machines roaring, the smell of iron and grease clinging to my clothes. I remembered skipping dinners to pay another installment, telling my wife we'll eat simple tonight so they can eat better tomorrow. That sentence echoed in me, cutting deeper now, because the very child I had sacrificed for stood there trying to strip me of my name. I shifted my gaze across the hall, watching the crowd from a new angle, their eyes no longer pitying me, but sharp, alert, waiting. I caught sight of my grandson in his graduation robe, his hands trembling as he held his diploma. His eyes flicked between me and his father, confusion fighting with pride. That look, half fearful, half pleading, was a break in the rhythm of betrayal. It pulled me forward. I gripped the microphone tighter, and my voice rose, no longer just steady, but sharp enough to pierce. "You think money built your path?" I said, turning my eyes to my son. "No. It was the nights I gave up my rest, the meals I pushed aside, the cold winters, when I patched the same coat year after year. It was the years I carried your debts, quietly burning away my health so that you might walk lighter." The words tumbled out, echo meeting break. Each sentence carried the throb of sacrifice. Each pause split it open with the ache of betrayal. From the corner of my eye, I saw the audience shift again. Some leaned forward, their jaws tight. Others dabbed at their eyes. Symbolic variety filled the room, the ledger on the podium, the trembling diploma in my grandson's hands, the bright tassels swaying like fragile threads of legacy. I turned back to the microphone, but this time I leaned closer, my voice softer, almost breaking. "And what did you do with it, son? You took the coat off my back and called it yours. You took the bread off my plate and said you bought it. And tonight you would take the years of my life, stand on this stage, and make them your own. The hall felt utterly still. The sound of the air conditioner hummed like a low drum, a background to the tension snapping tight. I lifted the ledger, its pages fluttering as though alive. This is not just paper, I said, my voice breaking into first person, the raw I that could no longer hide behind restraint. This is me. My sweat. My lungs. My back. 30 years of it. You cannot erase me with a lie. Not here. Not now. The crowd rose into applause, not explosive, but a deep rolling wave like thunder crawling across the sky. Each clap was not just for me, but against the theft of what I had endured. And my son, his face blanched, his jaw set, stood frozen, caught between the truth and the storm he had stirred. The applause ebbed, but did not vanish. It lingered like the last roll of thunder before the sky clears. My chest rose and fell, the ledger heavy in my grip, its worn spine pressing into my palm. I set it down on the podium with care, the pages flaring open, as though they too wanted to speak. Across the stage, my son's shoulders squared, his jaw clenched, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The silence between us grew sharp like glass about to shatter. My grandson's diploma gleamed in his trembling hands, tassels swaying in the airless stillness. I stepped forward, closing the space, my voice gathering again, not loud but steady iron, wrapped in calm. Do you see this? I lifted the ledger with one hand, its weight pulling my wrist down. Every page is a night I worked while you slept. Every line of ink is a debt I carried so you wouldn't drown. 30 years, written in sweat and sacrifice. I turned my body, rotating my angle, and pointed toward the diploma in my grandson's grasp. The paper shook in his hands, his eyes wide as though caught between two worlds. And do you see that I said softer now, almost breaking? That is the fruit of those years. That is legacy. Not a trophy to be stolen, not a stage to be hijacked, but the rightful harvest of endurance. The air shifted. A woman in the second row pressed a tissue to her cheek. A man near the aisle leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if he too bore the ledger's weight. I let the silence expand, echo, and break before leaning into the microphone, first person bleeding through. I will not let you trade my years for applause that doesn't belong to you. I will not watch you tear the bread from my grandson's hands as you once tore it from mine. The words landed heavy, and then slowly I reached into my jacket pocket. The paper crackled faint but sharp, drawing every eye. A folded slip, different from the ledger, smaller, wider, clean. I placed it gently beside the ledger on the podium. This, I said, holding it aloft for the hall to see, is the savings account I built for him, quietly, steadily over decades. While you wasted, I prepared. While you demanded, I gave. And while you claimed, I kept building, so that when this day came, the truth would stand taller than any lie. A murmur surged through the crowd, some gasps, some claps, all converging into a swell that pressed against the walls. My grandson's eyes brimmed, his fingers tightening around the diploma as though it had just doubled in weight. And my son, he staggered half a step back, as if struck not by my hand, but by the ledger, the diploma, and the savings paper united against him. The hall no longer belonged to him. It no longer even belonged to me. It belonged to the truth now, and truth was unforgiving. The hall quivered with the echo of my words, yet silence returned like a held breath. The ledger rested on the podium, the savings slip gleaming beside it under the stage lights. My son's face flushed dark red, his lips moving but no sound coming. He wanted to reclaim the microphone to claw back the moment, but the room no longer bent to him. I steadied myself, letting the hush settle. The arc had to shift quicker, now sharper. I slid my hand into the inner pocket of my jacket once more, and this time what emerged was not white but yellowed with years. The paper trembled between my fingers, edges, brittle corners, eaten by time. A copy of an old loan agreement, one of dozens I had signed to rescue him when his debts came due. The sight of it struck him harder than any word. His eyes widened, sweat gathered at his temple. I could almost hear the memory whispering back at him, the shouting collectors, the bills piling on the counter, the father who stepped in when the son would not. I lifted it slowly, letting the audience see. This, I said, my voice low steady, was my chain. Not once, not twice, but year after year I carried debts that were not mine. I paid them with my back, my blood, my very breath. And you called it love, though you never once called it yours. My grandson clutched his diploma tighter, the tassel brushing against his cheek. From where I stood, the young man looked like the true mirror of my years, hopeful, trembling, but worthy. I shifted the paper in my hand, holding it above the flame of the ceremonial candle that sat at the podium's edge. A ripple ran through the crowd, gasps, whispers, the scrape of a chair leg against the floor. I will not pass this burden on, I declared. The first lick of fire caught the corner of the lone note, curling it black. The chain ends here. The flame consumed the page, ashes flaking into the air, drifting like black snow over the podium. I let the crowd see the act, slow and deliberate, every crackle loud in the silence. In that moment, I felt my own voice break into the first person fully. I have burned away your lies, your debts, your shadow. And I stand with nothing but the truth and the son who deserves it. The hall erupted. Applause thundered against the high ceiling, a wave that lifted my grandson's tears into light. Strangers were on their feet, clapping, some shouting bravo. Others wiped at their eyes, nodding to themselves as though they too had fathers who carried too much too long. My son, however, stumbled backward. He looked small now, smaller than I had ever seen him, his hands trembling at his sides. The echo and the break had shattered the stage beneath him. He was no longer part of the story the room believed. The ashes floated down, and for the first time in decades, my shoulders felt lighter. The last ash drifted down from my burned loan paper, disappearing against the polished wood of the stage. For a breath, silence held us all. Then came a sound I had not expected. A woman in the third row stood up, her voice firm yet trembling. My father did the same, she said, eyes shining. Worked 3 jobs to keep me in school while I wasted years. I see him in you tonight. Her words broke the dam. Another man rose, then another. From different corners of the hall, voices poured out like scattered embers finding flame. My dad paid my first tuition check. My mother pawned her wedding ring so I could stand here in this cap and gown. I owe every step to a sacrifice I can never repay. Their words circled me, lifted me, carried me higher than the rafters above. And I, still gripping the microphone, felt my chest tighten. For the first time, I was not just a father. I was the voice of 1,000 unseen labors, the living ledger of countless forgotten debts. My son shifted uneasily at the edge of the stage. Each testimony pressed him smaller, pushed him further into shadow. He tried to speak, but the sound of hands clapping, slow at first, then rising into a storm, drowned him out. I felt the need to answer them, to weave their voices into mine. My hand steadied the microphone, and I leaned forward. You see, I said, my voice breaking into the first person, firm as stone. It was never about money. It was about the nights I stayed awake, the mornings I rose before dawn. Every father in this room knows that story. We don't put it in ledgers. We put it in our children. The applause surged again, and I saw my grandson's shoulders square, his head lifting. He looked out at the crowd. For the first time, he did not look ashamed of the scene. He looked proud. I turned slightly, changing the angle, letting my eyes sweep over the hall. In the rows of robes and proud families, I caught fragments, tears caught in lashes, hands pressed over mouths, nods of recognition. Echo and break their emotions mirrored mine, then shattered into their own confessions. From somewhere behind me, the sound technician raised the microphone volume, as if the hall itself wanted my words to echo deeper. I will not let lies rewrite 30 years of truth, I said. Not here, not tonight, not while these walls hold our witness. The hall roared. Feet stamped against the floor, chairs rattled, the very air seemed to shake. My son shrank into a corner, his face pale, unable to withstand the blaze of all those eyes. And in that thunder, I felt the climax rising still higher, still unfinished, like a wave yet to crash. The applause thundered around me, but I knew the moment was not yet complete. The hall was alive, breathing with 100 hearts, all waiting, all demanding something more. I could feel it in the tremor of the floor beneath my shoes and the pulse of light bouncing off the polished stay. I reached into the inside pocket of my worn jacket. My hand brushed against leather softened by years, corners bent from use. The noise dimmed like the hall itself sensed what was about to come. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out the small savings book. It looked ordinary, no gold trim, no fine paper, just faded blue cover edges frayed. But when I held it up, it caught the stage light like a relic. Gasps rippled through the rows. I could hear the soft rustle of robes, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward. I did not save money for pride, I said, my voice raw, slipping fully into the air. I did not starve myself of small joys so someone could boast on my behalf. This, I lifted the book higher, my hand trembling but firm as 30 years of sweat, hidden away dollar by dollar, meant only for him. My grandson froze, his eyes wide, his lips parted as if the words had struck him clean through. I turned, crossing the stage in slow, unshaken steps. Each footfall echoed in the silence, echo and break like a hammer striking. My son tried to intercept me, his hand jerking forward, but the crowd hissed a tide rising against him. He stopped, retreating into the shadow as if the hall itself had turned. Kneeling before my grandson, I pressed the book into his hands. His fingers closed around it hesitantly as though afraid it might vanish. I saw his chest rise sharply, his breath caught. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Grandpa," and then the hall erupted. Not applause. This time, cheers, shouts, stamping feet. A standing ovation that rolled through the room like thunder shaking the rafters. Teachers clapped, parents wept, students pounded the wooden floor with their heels. I stood again, lifting my chin, scanning the hall from a new angle. The wide sweep of light, catching faces wet with tears. Hands clasped in respect, strangers nodding at me as though I had spoken for them all. My voice cut once more through the storm's steady final. No man, no matter how loud, will ever steal what belongs to sacrifice. Not while I stand. The words landed heavy, breaking the last of the tension. My son sank into his seat, his shoulders folding. My grandson clutched the book to his chest, a single tear slipping down his cheek. The microphone still hummed in my hand, but for once I did not need it. The hall itself carried my truth. The ovation did not fade quickly. It swelled, broke, then swelled again like waves pounding ashore. I could feel the vibration of it in my ribs and the soles of my feet pressed against the stage floor. The hall had shifted, no longer a place of ceremony, but a place of truth. When the applause thinned, I saw him. My son. He sat stiff in his chair, eyes fixed downward, jaw clenched tight. The air around him was heavy with shame, yet he did not move, as though rooted in the weight of his own undoing. Meanwhile, my grandson rose from his seat. The savings book pressed to his chest, he walked to the microphone I had left trembling on its stand. He hesitated, then looked at me. I nodded once, steady, giving him the bridge he needed. His voice cracked at first, but it grew stronger with each word. "This is not my father's doing. This is my grandfather's. He is the reason I stand here. Every page in this book is proof of his sacrifice." The hall stilled again. A silence deep enough to hear the faint buzz of the ceiling lights, the shuffle of someone wiping their eyes in the back row. Then the sound came, not applause this time, but whispers, murmurs, cascading like a ripple he saved for him. 30 years, the boy knows the truth now. I watched my son flinch at those words, the judgment settling around him like a net he could not tear through. He lifted his head for a moment, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time, there was no fire in them, only a hollow recognition, a mirror reflecting back his loss. From another angle, up in the balcony, I could see faces glistening with tears, teachers nodding solemnly, parents clutching their children a little tighter. The symbol had shifted. The microphone was no longer his weapon of pride, but my grandson's torch of acknowledgement. I stepped closer, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. His small frame shook beneath my touch, but he stood tall. I whispered, so only he could hear, "Hold onto this moment. It is heavier than any diploma." He nodded, his eyes locked forward, his knuckles whitening around the savings book. And then the cheer returned, roaring, deafening, breaking the walls of the hall. It was not for me alone anymore. It was for him too, for the boy who understood, for the truth that had broken free, for the silence that had been shattered by a single act of defiance and love. I raised my hand once more, not to silence them, but to let the sound wash over us, both sealing the memory into the marrow of everyone present. The hall was still alive with echoes of applause when the first voice broke through, sharp, unyielding, cutting across the noise. "You should be ashamed," an old teacher called from the side row, her frail hands gripping her cane. Her voice trembled, but her words landed heavy. I remember the boy's grandfather walking in the rain shoes, soaked just to make sure tuition was never late. That was not your money. That was his. The ripple began. Parents, neighbors, even strangers rising like witnesses in a courtroom. A man from the second row stood, a factory foreman who had known me in my younger days. "I saw you, Max," he said, his rough voice carrying. "Hands blistered from overtime, never once complaining. And I saw your son rolling in his car, never lifting a finger." His eyes narrowed at my boy. "You tried to steal the truth today. But truth has a longer breath than lies." My son's face burned crimson. He tried to rise to defend himself, but each time he opened his mouth, another voice cut him down. A nurse, once a neighbor, spoke up. "Do you know who paid my husband's medical bill when no one else could? Your father." She pointed straight at him, her voice quivering with both gratitude and anger. "You dishonor that kind of heart with your arrogance." From the balcony, a pastor leaned forward, voice booming like a sermon. "What does it profit a man to claim credit for what he never sowed? Your father's 30 years were seeds. Today the hall blooms because of him, not you." Every accusation, every memory stacked upon him like stone after stone. I could see his shoulders curl, his frame shrinking under the weight. He covered his face with his hands, but the hall did not relent. I took a breath, feeling the storm whirl around me. Then I spoke, not loud but steady. "Enough." The word cracked like a gavel. The voices still, leaving only the faint hum of the ceiling lights and the ragged sound of his breathing. I stepped toward him, the space between us shrinking like a noose tightening. "Do you hear them?" I asked, my voice shifting to the first person, letting the raw truth spill. "It's not just me anymore. It's the world that has seen you. You wanted a stage, and here it is. But the role you wrote for yourself, you cannot play it. Because every line of this story belongs to me." The hall erupted again, not applause this time, but murmurs of agreement, nods, tears, the collective judgment of a community that had borne witness. My son's eyes darted, searching for an escape, but there was none. Every door in that hall was blocked by truth. And in that moment I knew this was not just my battle anymore. It was the turning of a tide. The public climax had taken shape, not with fists or fury, but with a chorus of voices that could no longer be silenced. The murmurs still clung to the air when I reached into my jacket. My son lowered his hands from his face, his eyes narrowing, suspicion tangled with fear. I felt the weight of the small leather book in my palm, a ledger I had carried for years, its corners worn pages, filled with the faded ink of sacrifice. I held it up so everyone could see. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is 30 years of nights spent in silence, 30 winters without new shoes, 30 summers where my hands blistered under the sun. Every dollar, every cent written here." The hall leaned in. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker, casting shadows that deepened the lines on my face. I turned the pages slowly, letting the sound of paper echo through the silence. Line after line, month after month. Payments for school supplies, medical bills, rent when times were lean. The endless tuition checks that carried my granddaughter forward. Each entry was a scar, but together they formed a map of love. I let the silence stretch, then broke it. "You said it was your money. But here," I tapped the ink with my finger, the gesture sharp, final. "Here is the truth." My son shook his head, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. That doesn't prove anything. Anyone can write in a book." His words were weak, falling flat against the tension. I stepped closer, shifting into the first person, my tone cutting through the doubt. "Then look around you. Ask the calluses on my hands. Ask the nights I came home too tired to eat. Ask the neighbors who saw me patching roofs at midnight, hauling crates before dawn. This ledger isn't just ink, it's my body, my breath, my years carved into paper. A sound rose, a clap. Then another, until the hall thundered applause, rolling like a storm breaking loose. Faces blurred into one tide of affirmation. Tears glistened on the cheeks of old friends. Strangers nodded solemnly, my granddaughter's small hands clapped hardest of all. The symbolic act was complete. I had not raised my voice nor struck with anger, but I had opened the book of my life in front of them all. The lie had been shattered not with rage, but with evidence no one could deny. And as the applause swelled, I felt something heavier than pride. A release. Years of silence finally unburdened the truth, no longer mine alone, but carried now by every witness in that hall. The applause washed over the hall, a crashing wave that left no corner untouched. My hands trembled as I closed the ledger, the leather soft with age, the weight of it heavier than stone. For a moment, I thought the silence of my son might hold, but then he broke. His voice rose jagged and raw. You think this makes you noble? You think showing off a book makes you a saint? You never gave me enough? Never. His words cracked, echoing like glass shattering against marble. I looked at him, my own flesh and blood, and saw the mask slip. The polished pride that had carried him through years of half-truths and stolen credit now wilted under the lights. His eyes darted from row to row, searching for sympathy, but found only the steady weight of judgment. I shifted my stance first person again, letting my words carry not just to him, but to every ear. You say I never gave you enough, son. I gave you so much I had nothing left for myself. I carried your debts, erased your mistakes, and built a future for your child from the ruins of my own comfort. If that is not enough, then nothing in this world ever will be. The echo was sharp, then broken by a stillness so deep it felt holy. I let the silence stretch, then turned, widening the angle. I saw old neighbors' faces lined with recognition. One man whispered, I remember him on the roofs at dawn. A teacher from the past hands, clasped, nodded through tears. Even the pastor seated near the front bowed his head as though at an altar of truth. The rotation of eyes was unbearable for my son. His face flushed, his chest heaved. He reached out almost as if to snatch the ledger from my hand, but stopped halfway. The air had shifted. This was no longer his stage. It belonged to me and to the truth carried by every witness in the hall. I lifted the ledger one final time. This book, I said, voice steady as iron, does not need your approval. It needs only the memory of those who saw the hands that clapped, the voices that now know. My sacrifice is not your story to steal. A hush fell heavier than any roar. The micro-motions told the rest, my granddaughter clutching her diploma tighter, her lips quivering, my son's hands shaking at his sides, the rustle of clothes as strangers leaned closer, bound in the gravity of the moment. The mask had cracked, and beneath it only the raw face of betrayal remained. The hall trembled with silence after my son's outburst. His face was red, his chest rising and falling as if he were drowning. That was the moment I moved. I stepped forward, my shoes clicking against the polished floor. The microphone lay between us, dangling in his grip like a stolen crown. I reached out, not with force, but with the weight of years, and wrapped my fingers around it. His hand resisted for a heartbeat, but then faltered. The steel in my eyes must have told him this was no longer his moment. The mic was warm, alive with the echo of his selfish words. I raised it, and my voice carried through the hall. No, I said the word, striking like a bell. It was not your money. It was not your sacrifice. 30 years of sweat, 30 years of nights spent mending roofs, carrying bricks, saving scraps of bread. Those years are standing here today in her diploma. A murmur ran through the audience, soft as wind stirring tall grass. I let it grow, then cut it clean. And if you doubt me, I continued, lifting the old ledger in my other hand. Then look here. Every entry, every penny, every sacrifice, carved into ink. This is not just paper. This is my life's marrow, pressed into lines no one can erase. The lights above burned hotter, the angle narrowing onto me as though the hall itself conspired to expose truth. I saw my son shrink in the corner of my vision, his body twisting away, unable to bear the gaze of hundreds. I shifted the microphone closer, my voice softer now, the kind that digs deeper because it doesn't need to shout. A father's work is not for glory. It is for love. But love is not a mask you can wear when it suits you. It is not a debt you can claim when convenient. Tonight, I end the theft of my sacrifice. The echo rippled, broke, then rebuilt itself in the applause that began like raindrops, slow and scattered. A clap here, a clap there, until it grew rolling like thunder. Faces lit with fire, some nodding, some weeping. The hall had turned no longer a place of accusation, but a temple of vindication. In the reflection of the microphone, I caught my own eyes. For once they did not look weary. They burned alive with a truth that could not be stolen. The applause swelled until it pressed against the walls, echoing off every chandelier and marble pillar. But I didn't let it drown the truth. I leaned into the microphone again, the weight of the moment tightening in my chest. I want you to see, I said, my voice breaking into the hush that followed. With trembling fingers, I opened the old ledger, its spine creaking like an old friend awakening. The yellowed pages caught the stage light, and every line of faded ink gleamed as if it had been carved into stone. I turned the book outward so the hall could see month after month of numbers, sacrifices tallied like scars. $50 for her textbooks. $200 for rent when they couldn't pay. $20 saved each week from meals skipped. The handwriting was uneven, blotched by sweat, but real. Indelible. A gasp rippled through the audience, not loud, but collective. I caught a woman in the second row, covering her mouth, her eyes wet. Somewhere in the back, a man whispered, "My God." I felt the burn of tears at the corners of my own eyes, but I let them shine beneath the spotlights. This is not just money, I said, my voice steady now. These pages are my nights, my mornings. My body bent over labor so a dream could rise higher than my own shoulders. And no one will rewrite this ledger and steal it as their story. The camera of every angle seemed to shift in my mind, a close-up of the trembling page, a wide shot of the hall, every face turned toward me, then back to my son, frozen, his arms folded tight against his chest, as though he could shield himself from the truth. I drew a deep breath and lifted the book higher. A diploma does not grow from a bank account. It grows from devotion. If my son wants to claim otherwise, let him write his own book of sacrifice. But he cannot erase mine. The silence that followed was electric, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm breaks. Then, like the crack of thunder, the applause returned, louder, uncontainable. People rose from their seats, one after another, until the entire hall was on its feet. From the corner of my vision, I saw the dean himself rise, clapping his face, solemn yet admiring. Beside him, a cluster of students began chanting softly, the rhythm rising, "Grandfather, grandfather, grandfather." It spread, rolling through the hall like a tide. And in that chant, in that storm of hands clapping and voices lifting, I felt something inside me settle. Not pride, not vindication. Something older, quieter, the truth finally standing in the open air, undeniable. The chant still echoed in the rafters, but I knew the moment demanded more than voices. It demanded proof that could not be twisted. I lowered the ledger, pressing it close to my chest, and with my other hand reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The lining was frayed from years of wear, and my fingers brushed against the thin, leather-bound book that had been hidden there for decades. For a heartbeat, the hall grew restless, the applause tapering into murmurs. I let the silence stretch, then pulled the book free. Its cover was cracked, edges worn smooth from handling, but its weight was heavier than gold. I lifted it high, the light catching the embossed word, "savings account." My son says it was his money, I said, my voice carrying steady across the hall. But this is the truth of 30 years. The hush deepened. Every angle seemed to shift at once. A close-up on the trembling book in my hand, a wide pan across rows of dignitaries. In disbelief, the camera of memory zooming into nights. I'd work by lamplight, counting coins into envelopes marked with my granddaughter's name. I flipped the book open, pages fluttering like wings. The entries shone under the harsh light deposits in neat script, each marked with my initials. Year after year. Small amounts at first $5, $10, the price of a skipped meal or a missed comfort, then larger as my labor bore fruit, until the numbers swelled enough to carry a child through school. This, I said, voice cracking into the hush, was never his. This was never taken from me by force. This was given freely, quietly, with love. For her. I turned toward the front row. My granddaughter sat frozen in her gown cap, trembling in her hands. Her lips parted, eyes wide, the truth dawning like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I extended the savings book to her. My hands shook not from weakness but from the gravity of the moment. This belongs to you, not because anyone demanded it, not because of threats, but because a grandfather's promise is sacred. I vowed to carry you as far as I could, and today you walk the rest of the way on your own. The gesture rippled through the room like a wave breaking against stone. A single clap burst out, then another, until the hall roared again. But it was different now, heavier, fuller. People were not just clapping for a speech. They were clapping for a life, measured out in quiet, unclaimed sacrifices. I caught my son's face in the corner of my eye. His jaw-clenched eyes, darting, searching for a defense. But none came. Not when the book itself bore witness. Not when the crowd had seen with their own eyes. And in that echoing storm of hands and voices, I felt something break the silence of decades, the chain of false claims. What remained was only truth laid bare beneath the lights. The hall still rang with applause, when a sudden, jagged shout cut through the tide. My son surged forward, face red, eyes wild. He jabbed a finger at me, the sound of his voice cracking like glass against stone. This is a trick, all of it. He's lying he forged those entries, he just wants to make me look small. The hall gasped, the wave of clapping stalling midair. Chairs scraped against the floor as heads turned, the sudden break in rhythm, echoing louder than the clamor itself. I held the savings book steady in my hand, letting his words hang in the space like smoke too thin to choke anyone. Echo. Break. He lunged toward the stage, his suit jacket flaring, open tie, crooked every step, screaming desperation. Two ushers moved, unsure if they should intervene, but I raised my hand. Let him come, I said, my voice low, yet carrying a calm stone dropped into turbulent water. I shifted my weight and looked directly at him. Every angle of the hall seemed to tilt toward that moment, spotlight burning on his distorted face, wide shot of the crowd, leaning in close-up on my hand, steady and open over the fragile ledger. You claim I forged 30 years of sacrifice. I asked, the words slow, deliberate. You would call your own father a liar before this hall, before your daughter, before God himself. The room grew still, tighter than breath. His mouth opened, then closed the fury, breaking into fragments in his eyes. He turned, seeking an ally, but every gaze that met his was sharp, accusing, unyielding. I raised my voice, not in anger, but in something stronger, finality. For years I gave, and still, you shouted, it was not enough. Today you tried to take credit for what was never yours. And now in front of this hall I give you nothing but silence. Because silence is all you've earned. A murmur ran through the room, then applause erupted again, harder, sharper, as if every clap was a nail sealing his coffin of excuses. My granddaughter clutched the savings book to her chest, tears spilling freely, while my son stood frozen, stripped bare by the weight of truth and the eyes of 100 witnesses. The arc had shifted. No longer was I defending myself. I was closing the circle, breaking the cycle. What he had shouted in arrogance was now swallowed whole by the echo of his own downfall. And as the sound of the crowd swelled, I let my hand fall back to my side. I didn't need to raise my voice again. The hall had spoken for me. The storm had broken, and the hall was no longer a battlefield. Applause rose again, not in frenzy this time, but in waves of steady affirmation, like the tide reclaiming the shore after a violent crash. I stood still, letting the sound wash over me, not for pride, not for victory, but for closure. My granddaughter stepped forward, clutching the savings book. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from a weight too large for her years. I placed my palm gently over hers. It's yours now, I whispered. Not for the hall, not for the cameras, but for her heart alone. Together we stepped down from the stage. The light shifted, less harsh, more human, as if the hall itself understood what had been sealed. My son remained standing frozen in his own silence, the crowd no longer his to command. He had chased the microphone but lost the voice. He had demanded the stage but lost the story. I guided my granddaughter through the rows of clapping hands, past the bowed heads of neighbors, past the murmurs of those who had witnessed truth unveiled. At the doors, I turned back just once. The hall was still bright, but his figure seemed smaller, now swallowed by his own shadow. Outside, the evening air met us cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and the distant hum of summer cicadas. The world went on. Life moved forward. And so did we. I had said my piece. The hall had heard. The legacy was safe. Now they know. Dear friends, thank you for walking with me through this story. If it has touched you, if it has reminded you of the quiet sacrifices hidden in your own family, I hope you carry that truth gently. Please take care of yourselves and of those you love. Wishing you health, peace, and happiness for you and your family.